He didn't save the boy out of kindness. Park Tae-min didn't do kindness. He did transactions. Calculations. Control. So when he wired the money for a stranger's child's surgery, anonymously, quietly, without a single person knowing, even he couldn't explain why. He told himself it was nothing. A write-off. A moment of weakness he'd never repeat. Then he went to the hospital to check on his investment. And walked straight into the one secret that was about to destroy everything he'd built. Before we continue, I need to pause for just a second. We are this close to 10,000 subscribers. And I mean close. Every single person who hits that button right now is helping us get there. So if this story is already pulling you in, please subscribe. It takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely means the world. And I would love to know where you're listening from. Drop it in the comments, your city, your country, wherever you are in the world. I read every single one, and it never gets old knowing that this little story found you. Okay. Back to Tae-min. Because here's what he didn't know when he walked into room 412. He didn't know that the boy in that hospital bed had his grandmother's eyes. He didn't know that the woman who came through that door, exhausted, coffee in hand, visitor's badge crooked on her shirt, was the only person he had ever let himself love. And he didn't know that in about 72 hours, a DNA result reading 99.9% paternity confirmed was going to crack open a man who had survived everything. A man who commands armies. Brought to his knees by a 7-year-old with a nasal tube and calm, ancient eyes. This is their story. And it starts the moment the door opens. Park Tae-min had, by conservative estimate, ended 17 lives. Not with his hands. He wasn't sentimental about the distinction, but he was precise about it. Orders given across clean tables in quiet rooms. A nod. A name. The rest handled by men who were paid to handle the rest. 17, conservatively. The number that kept a clean conscience wasn't something he'd ever pursued. He did not lose sleep. He did not, as a rule, give money to strangers. And yet, the file had come across his desk 6 weeks ago, not through any channel he'd invited, but through Min-suk, who had a cousin who worked hospital administration, who mentioned, offhandedly, the way people mention things they don't realize are significant, that there was a boy on the pediatric floor with no father on record and a mother working double shifts as a nurse's aide to cover a surgery her insurance had declined twice. Congenital heart defect. Operable, if done soon. Expensive, if done properly. Min-suk had mentioned it and moved on. Tae-min had said nothing. 3 days later, he wired the money. Anonymous transfer. Clean account. No trail that would embarrass anyone. He didn't examine the impulse. Examining impulses was how men like him got soft, and softness, in his world, was a vulnerability dressed in the clothes of a virtue. He filed it away as noise. A brief, inexplicable deviation from character that he would not repeat. He had repeated exactly none of his weaknesses since he was 22 years old. He told himself this was the same. He told himself this on the drive to the hospital. In the elevator. Walking the corridor with Min-suk 2 steps behind and the particular stillness around him that always preceded a room changing when he entered it. He was here to observe. To confirm the surgery had proceeded as funded. To close the file in the way that men like him close files, with confirmation, with finality, with the clean satisfaction of a thing completed. He was not here for anything else. Room 412 was at the end of the hall. He could hear the soft machinery of it before he reached the door. Monitors. Ventilation. The low, indifferent hum of a building designed to keep people alive through the night. He stopped in the doorway. The boy was small. Smaller than the file had made him seem, though files never account for smallness. for the specific fragility of a child sitting upright in a bed built for a body twice his size, oxygen tube resting under his nose, hands folded in his lap like a man waiting for a meeting to begin. He looked up. He did not flinch. Taemin stood there, a man who had ordered deaths from penthouses, who had built an empire on the precise application of fear, and felt, for one unguarded second, something he could not immediately name. He stepped inside. The boy's name was Cairo. Taemin knew this from the file. He knew the name, the age, the diagnosis, the surgical notes, the prognosis. Good, now, better than it would have been without intervention, and he had known all of it in the abstract, clinical way that information exists before it has a face attached to it. Before it sits across from you in a hospital bed and looks at you without blinking. Cairo Vaughn. 7 years old. Calm in a way that children are not usually calm. He watched Taemin enter the room the way he might watch weather move across a window, with interest, without alarm, like a boy who had already decided that whatever came through that door was something he could handle. Taemin found this, unexpectedly, difficult to look away from. He stood at the foot of the bed with his hands clasped behind his back, the posture of a man who had learned, young, that stillness project's authority, and had never since found a reason to unlearn it. He studied the child. The child studied him back. It was the boy who spoke first. "Are you a doctor?" "No." "A nurse?" "Also no." Cairo tilted his head. The oxygen tube shifted slightly with the movement. "Then why are you in my room?" Taemin considered the question the way he considered all questions, not for the answer, but for what the question revealed about the person asking it. Most adults who didn't know who he was found him unsettling in the doorway. They shifted. They looked away. They filled silence with noise to make themselves comfortable. This boy had simply asked. "I wanted to see how you were doing," Taemin said. "Do you know me?" "Not yet." Cairo seemed to weigh this. Then, apparently satisfied with the honesty of it, he settled back slightly against his pillows. Not relaxing, Taemin got the impression this child didn't fully relax, but recalibrating. Deciding, in whatever quiet interior calculus a 7-year-old runs, that the man in the expensive suit was not an immediate threat. "My mom's coming back soon," Cairo said. Not as a warning. As information, offered plainly. "I know," Taemin said. He didn't know. But he said it the way he said most things, with a certainty he'd constructed on the spot and would defend until a better position emerged. He moved to the chair beside the bed. He did not sit. Sitting felt too close to settling, and he wasn't settled, but he rested one hand on the back of it and looked at the boy properly. At his face. The straight black hair, simply cut. The dark eyes. The quality of attention in them, that particular stillness. Something was pulling at the edge of his thinking. Something he didn't have language for yet, which was a sensation he deeply distrusted. "Does it hurt?" Taemin asked. "Sometimes." Cairo looked down at his own hands in his lap, then back up. "Less now." Before the surgery it was like, he paused, searching. Like someone was squeezing. "Here." He touched his sternum, lightly, with 2 fingers. "And now?" "Now it just feels tired." "The doctor says that's normal." "It is," Taemin said. He had no medical authority to say this. He said it anyway, and with enough certainty that the boy nodded, apparently reassured. They sat in a silence that should have been uncomfortable and wasn't. Taemin couldn't account for that either. He was not a man who found silence with strangers comfortable. He found it tactical. But this was different. This felt, he reached for the word and couldn't find it. Cairo was looking at his hands again. The ones folded in his lap. Long fingers for a boy his size. Precise, even at rest. The pull became a tug. He was looking at the hands and trying to locate why they were familiar when the door opened. She came in the way people come in when they're carrying too many things and trying not to drop any of them. Coffee cup, a bag over one shoulder, a visitor's badge that had been clipped on without looking, slightly crooked. She was looking at her phone. She was saying something before she'd fully entered the room, something about the vending machine on the third floor being out of the crackers Cairo liked, and that she'd found something else, and she looked up. She saw him. The coffee cup did not fall. He registered this later as a significant act of self-control, the way her hand locked around it, white-knuckled, in the single second between recognition and whatever she'd decided to do with it. Her face moved through something complicated and landed somewhere just past pale. Taemin looked at Sienna Vaughn for the first time in 8 years. The room did not change. The monitor continued its soft rhythm. Cairo looked between them the way children look when they sense that the adults in the room have suddenly stopped being in the same room as each other. 8 years. She looked like herself. She looked like someone who had worked very hard to become someone else and nearly succeeded. She opened her mouth. Get out. And Taemin, who did not take orders from anyone alive, stood very still and did not move. He had heard those 2 words from her before. 8 years ago, in a different room, in a different city, at the end of a night that had started with dinner and ended with her standing at the door of his apartment with her coat on and her eyes dry in the particular way that meant she had already cried somewhere he hadn't seen. She had said get out even though it was his apartment, because what she meant was get out of my life, and he had understood her, and he had let her go, and he had told himself for 8 years that it was the right thing. He had been very convincing. Sienna. He said her name the way a man says a word he stopped letting himself think about. Carefully. Like something that might still have edges. I said get out. Her voice was quiet. Razor quiet. The kind of quiet that costs something to maintain. I'm not here to get out of my son's room. She stepped fully inside, moving between Taemin and the bed with the particular efficiency of a woman who had been protecting something for a long time and had gotten very good at it. Her back was to Cairo now. Her eyes were on Taemin. Don't make me call security. You won't call security. Don't tell me what I'll do. She was right. He shouldn't have said it. It was the kind of certainty that closed conversations instead of opening them, and he needed this conversation open. He adjusted. I'm not here to frighten you, he said. Quieter. I'm not here to cause you any problem. You existing within 50 feet of my child is a problem. Her jaw was set. Her hand still gripped the coffee cup, which was probably cold now, which she probably hadn't noticed. How did you find us? How did you even know? I didn't. He let that land. I didn't know you were here. I didn't know this was your son. She searched his face for the lie. He let her search. He had nothing to hide in this particular sentence, which was not a thing he could say about most sentences. Something shifted in her expression. Not softening. Sienna had never been soft, it was one of the things he had. He stopped that thought, folded it away. But the razor edge of her panic recalibrated into something more like wariness. She believed him, or believed him enough. Then why are you here, she said. Not a question. A demand for accounting. I funded the surgery. He said it plainly. No performance of generosity. No architecture of benevolence around it. Just the fact. The silence that followed had weight. He watched her process it, the series of small, rapid recalculations happening behind her eyes. The anonymous donor. The wire transfer her hospital contact had described as unusual, untraceable, and inexplicably large. She had asked questions and been given no answers. He knew this because Min-suk had handled it and Min-suk was very good at giving no answers. That was you. Barely a breath. Yes. Why? Her voice cracked on the single syllable. She pulled it back immediately, hated herself for the crack. He could see that too. He didn't answer. Not because he was withholding. He genuinely didn't have an answer that would survive being said aloud. Instead, his gaze moved past her. To Cairo, who had not made a sound through all of this, who sat in his hospital bed watching them with those dark, steady, ancient eyes. Taemin looked at the boy. He had been looking before, in the doorway, during their conversation, while the boy talked about the squeezing in his chest, but he had been looking at a child. A patient. A file made flesh. He had not been looking for himself. He looked now. The eyes first. The specific shape of the lid. The patience in the irises, not a child's patience, not the fidgeting waiting of someone who wants something, but the deep, structural stillness of someone who has learned to exist quietly inside circumstances they didn't choose. He knew that stillness. He had studied its architecture in old photographs, in his grandmother's face at the dinner table, in the mirror when he was young and learning to build walls out of composure. Then the hands. Still folded in his lap. He'd noticed them before and reached for a word and not found it. He found it now. His mother's hands. The specific length of the fingers. The way they rested, not limp, not tense, but precise. Deliberate even in repose. As if the hands understood something the rest of the body was still learning. The math arrived without invitation. 7 years old. 8 years since Sienna left. The hands. The eyes. The shape of the stillness. He did not move. He had spent 20 years learning not to let anything move him visibly, and he spent every gram of that discipline now, standing in a room that had just changed its geometry entirely, keeping his face exactly where he'd put it. Sienna was watching him. He could feel it. He pulled his gaze back to her. She saw something in his expression, he wasn't sure what, only that she saw it, because her face changed. The wariness became something else. Something older. Something afraid. Taemin. How old is he? Not a question. Her lips pressed together. Sienna. Quieter now. Something underneath it that he could not fully contain. How old is he? The monitor beeped softly. Cairo sat still. The cold coffee cup creaked under the pressure of her grip. 7, she said. She said it the way a person confesses something. The way a word costs everything on the way out. Taemin nodded once, very slowly, like a man confirming an equation he'd already solved. He turned and walked out of the room. The results came on a Thursday. Min-suk placed the envelope on the desk without a word, which was how Taemin preferred things delivered, without ceremony, without the performance of significance that people attached to moments they sensed were important. He had trained his staff out of dramatics the way you train anything out of anything. Consistently. Repeatedly. Without emotion. The envelope sat on the desk for 40 minutes before he touched it. He was on a call for 11 of those minutes. Reading contracts for 22. Signing 2 documents that moved a significant amount of money between accounts that didn't officially exist. Normal work. The work of a Thursday. He did all of it with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, which was total, which was the only kind of attention he knew. The envelope sat in his peripheral vision the entire time. He was not avoiding it. He did not avoid things. Avoidance was a form of fear, and fear was a form of weakness, and he had excised weakness from his character with the same precision and lack of sentiment with which a surgeon removes something that will kill you if left in place. He was simply finishing what he'd started. When the last document was signed, he set down his pen. Aligned it with the edge of the desk. Looked at the envelope. It was unremarkable. White. Standard size. The lab's name printed in the upper left corner in small, neutral font, the kind of font chosen specifically to convey nothing, which he had always found either admirable or dishonest depending on the context. He picked it up. Opened it with the letter opener he'd had for 14 years. Unfolded the single page inside. He read it once. Then he set it down on the desk and looked out the window. Seoul was doing what Seoul did in the early evening, burning gold and gray at the edges, the city's million lights beginning their nightly argument with the dark. He had looked at this view from this window for 6 years. He had made decisions from this window that shaped the architecture of entire industries. He had stood here after his father died and felt nothing, which had confirmed something about himself he'd already suspected. He looked at it now and did not see it. 99.9% paternity confirmed. He picked the paper up again. Read it again. The language was precise and impersonal, the way all scientific language is: probability tables, allele frequencies, a string of numbers that meant nothing until they meant everything. And at the bottom, in the same neutral font as the envelope, that figure. 99.9. Not a question. Not a possibility to be weighed against other possibilities. The remaining 0.1 existed only because laboratories did not, as a professional standard, print 100. It was a courtesy to mathematical uncertainty. It was not an invitation to doubt. He was Cairo Vaughn's father. He set the paper down again. This time he didn't pick it back up. He became aware, slowly, of his own breathing. This was unusual. He was not, as a rule, aware of his breathing. Awareness of breathing meant something had disrupted the automatic, which meant something had gotten through the layer of control he kept between himself and the world. He noticed the disruption the way you notice a sound in a house you've lived in long enough to know every sound it makes. Something was different. Something was out of place. His hand, he realized, was flat on the desk. Pressing down. As if the desk needed to be held in position. As if he did. 7 years. Cairo had been alive for 7 years. He had been somewhere in the world for 7 years, in hospitals, in school hallways, in an apartment in a city Taemin hadn't known to look in, and Taemin had been here, in this office, behind this glass, running this empire, and had not known. Had not been given the chance to know. That thought arrived with an edge he wasn't prepared for. He stood up from the desk. Moved to the window. Stood close enough that his breath faintly fogged the glass, which he noticed and stepped back from immediately. He thought about the boy's hands. He thought about the stillness in his eyes. The way he'd asked questions without fear. The way he'd sat in that hospital bed like a man in miniature, enduring something large with a quiet that shouldn't have been possible at that age. He thought about where that quality comes from. Whether it is learned or inherited. Whether a child can carry something in his bones from a father he has never met. He thought about Sienna's face when she said 7. The way the word had cost her. The way she'd known, in that moment, that he was doing the math, and had watched him do it, and said nothing to stop it. She had known. She had always known. That edge sharpened into something he refused to call grief and couldn't call anything else. He stood at the window for a long time. The city darkened. The lights brightened. The paper sat on his desk. When Min-suk knocked and entered, Taemin was back in his chair. Jacket on. Hands still. Face arranged into the expression that meant nothing was wrong, which was the expression he wore when everything was. Min-suk looked at the paper on the desk. Then at his boss. He said nothing. Clear my schedule, Taemin said. Tomorrow morning. All of it? All of it. Min-suk nodded and left without asking why. That was what 14 years of loyalty looked like. You learned when the why didn't belong to you. Taemin looked at the paper one more time. Then he opened his desk drawer, placed it inside, and closed it. As if putting it away would change what it contained. As if anything, now, could. He didn't call ahead. Men like Taemin didn't call ahead. Calling ahead gave people time to construct things, arguments, exits, versions of the truth that had been edited for an audience. He had built his entire career on the value of arriving before the story did. He saw no reason to change the approach now simply because the stakes were personal. He found her in the hospital cafeteria on her lunch break. 30 minutes, he'd been told by a staff member who hadn't known they were being asked. She was at a corner table with a container of food she hadn't opened, staring at nothing, doing the private arithmetic of a woman with too many problems and not enough variables that solved cleanly. She saw him coming. She had enough time to straighten, to put her face back together, to decide on an expression. She chose something that looked like calm and wasn't. He sat down across from her without being invited. He placed the folded lab report on the table between them. She looked at it. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. Sienna. Don't. Her voice was low. Controlled. The cafeteria moved around them, trays, conversation, the institutional smell of reheated food, and none of it touched the table they were sitting at. Don't say his name. Don't say the number. Just, give me a second. He gave her the second. He was not, by nature, a patient man. But he had learned that certain silences were more powerful than anything you could fill them with, and this was one of them. She closed her eyes briefly. Opened them. Looked at him. How did you get the sample? It doesn't matter. It matters to me. You had no right. I had every right. He said it quietly, but there was iron underneath it. If what that paper says is true, I had every right in the world. You had no right to do it without. Without what? Your permission? He leaned forward slightly. Still controlled. Still quiet. But something moving beneath the surface now, something he was no longer willing to spend energy containing. You didn't give me the option of permission, Sienna. You didn't give me any option at all. She looked away. Out the window. At the gray ordinary sky above the hospital car park. The kind of sky that offers nothing, no drama, no beauty, just the fact of weather. I left for a reason, she said. Tell me the reason. You know the reason. I want to hear you say it. A long pause. She pulled the unopened food container toward her, then pushed it away. Something to do with her hands. He recognized the gesture. She had always done things with her hands when she was buying time her mind needed. There was a night, she began. Then stopped. Reorganized. Do you remember Kim Jae-won? He remembered. He came to the apartment, she said. While you were away. He wasn't threatening, he was almost polite about it, which was worse. He sat in our kitchen and drank the coffee I made him because I didn't know what else to do, and he explained to me, very calmly, that my presence in your life was creating a liability. That people who wanted leverage over you had started watching me. She paused. He used that word. Leverage. Like I was a door someone could use to get to you. Taemin said nothing. He remembered Kim Jae-won. He remembered the conversation he'd had with him afterward, which had been brief and had resolved the situation in the way that situations were resolved in his world. He had not told Sienna about that conversation. He had decided, at the time, that not telling her was a form of protection. He was beginning to understand how she had experienced that protection. I was 3 weeks pregnant, she said. I didn't know yet. I found out 2 weeks after I left. She finally looked at him directly. Her eyes were dry. She had made some internal decision about tears. And I sat in that bathroom, in a city you didn't know I'd gone to, and I made a decision. To lie to him, Taemin said. For 7 years. To protect him. Her voice didn't rise. It never rose. That had always been the thing about Sienna, the way her most serious statements arrived quietly. I told him his father died before he was born. And I chose a life where no one would ever sit in my kitchen and explain to me what my child was worth to someone who wanted something from you. The cafeteria hummed around them. A child at another table laughed at something. The sound landed strangely. You should have told me, Taemin said. You were not someone I could tell. She said it without cruelty. That was the worst of it, she wasn't punishing him. She was simply describing the truth as she had lived it. The man I loved and the man you actually were, those were not the same man. And I couldn't raise a child on the difference between them. He sat with that. It was not the kind of sentence you deflect. It was the kind that finds the load-bearing wall of everything you've built about yourself and leans against it. He deserved to know his father, Taemin said finally. Yes, she said. Simply. He did. The word did sat between them. Past tense. The 7 years already spent, already gone, already a country neither of them could return to. He stood. Straightened his jacket. The reflex of a man who restores his armor before walking back into the world. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Sienna looked up at him. Something moved across her face that he couldn't fully read, not hope, not fear, but the complicated territory between them. I know, she said quietly. And somehow that was the most frightening thing she'd said yet. He came back the next morning. And the morning after that. He didn't announce himself to Sienna. He didn't ask permission, because asking permission implied it could be denied, and he wasn't prepared to test that boundary yet. He arrived before her shift ended, when Cairo was alone in the room with the morning light coming gray through the window and the monitors doing their quiet work, and he knocked, which was a thing he almost never did, and waited. Cairo said come in. He always said come in. As if he'd been expecting it. They had a system by the third visit, though neither of them had agreed to one. Taemin brought food, not hospital food, not the beige compromises of institutional catering, but things from outside. Proper things. The first morning it was a container of juk from a place 2 blocks away, still warm, because he'd read somewhere that it was easy on recovering hearts and he had not examined how much research he'd done in the preceding 48 hours. Cairo had looked at it seriously, the way he looked at everything seriously, and eaten most of it without complaint. The second morning Taemin brought tangerines, already peeled, in a small container. He didn't know why tangerines. He'd been standing in a shop and reached for them without thinking and hadn't second-guessed it. Cairo had eaten 3 of them and said they were good. He said most things plainly. Yes, no, good, I don't know. He had a child's vocabulary deployed with an old man's economy. He didn't perform happiness the way children sometimes performed it for adults they were trying to please. He didn't perform anything. He simply was, in whatever state he happened to be in, and reported it accurately when asked. Taemin found this, quietly, extraordinary. On the 4th morning Cairo asked him what he did for work. Taemin had prepared for this question the way he prepared for difficult negotiations, in advance, from multiple angles, with contingencies. He said he ran a business. Import and export. Cairo nodded as if this were a reasonable answer, which it was, technically, which was what made it useful. Do you like it? Cairo asked. No one had ever asked him that. It's what I'm good at, Taemin said. Cairo considered this with the particular seriousness he brought to anything that interested him. My mom says those aren't the same thing. Being good at something and liking it. Your mom is right. She usually is. He said this without resentment. As pure observation. Are you going to keep coming? The directness of it landed without warning. Taemin looked at the boy, at the steady eyes, the hands folded in his lap, the nasal tube that would come out in a few more days if recovery continued as projected, and felt the particular vertigo of a man who had spent his life controlling every variable in every room and had walked into one he couldn't control at all. Yes, he said. Why? He had the answer ready. A version of it. Something about the donation, about checking on his investment, the same scaffolding he'd used on himself for weeks. He opened his mouth. I'm not sure yet, he said instead. Cairo nodded slowly, as if this were the more satisfying answer, which perhaps it was. Children have a finely tuned instrument for detecting when adults are telling the truth. It was possible Cairo's was more finely tuned than most. They sat in a silence that had become, over 4 mornings, something close to comfortable. Outside the window a pigeon landed on the ledge and stayed for a while. Cairo watched it. Taemin watched Cairo. He was learning the boy in the way you learn a language you were told you'd never need, slowly, with the uncomfortable awareness that you should have started much sooner. The way he tilted his head at problems. The way he went quiet when he was tired, not irritable, just quieter, folding inward without drama. The small things he noticed, the pigeon, the change in the light, the different sound the monitor made when a nurse adjusted the settings 2 rooms over. He noticed everything. He reminded Taemin of no one so much as himself at that age, which was not a comfortable thing to sit with. That boy, the one he'd been at 7, in a different kind of difficult room, had needed something that nobody had known to give him. He looked at Cairo watching the pigeon on the ledge. Something in his chest arranged itself differently. Like a room being quietly, irrevocably, reordered. He reached into his jacket pocket and set another tangerine on the bedside table. Cairo glanced at it. Then at him. Almost smiled. Almost was enough, for now. The first person to notice was Min-suk. This was expected. Min-suk noticed everything. It was the quality that had made Taemin trust him, and the quality that occasionally made him inconvenient. He had the particular attentiveness of a man who understood that his survival depended on reading the room correctly, and he had been reading Taemin's room for 14 years with near-perfect accuracy. He said nothing for 9 days. On the 10th day he placed a folder on Taemin's desk during their morning briefing and said, with the careful neutrality of a man defusing something, the Kwon family is requesting a meeting. They've been patient. They won't be patient much longer. Schedule it. I've been trying to schedule it for 3 weeks. A pause. You've been unavailable. Taemin looked up from the document he was reading. Min-suk met his gaze without flinching, which was either loyalty or a very refined death wish. 14 years made it difficult to distinguish between the two. Schedule it for Thursday, Taemin said. Yes. Min-suk didn't move. There's also the matter of the Incheon shipment. The delay is now at 11 days. Chairman Bae has called twice. I'm aware. The men are asking questions. Let them ask. Boss. Min-suk said the word carefully. Not a title right now, a punctuation mark. A request for attention. You have missed 4 things in the last 2 weeks that you have never missed in 14 years. People notice the things you miss in the same way they notice the things you do. The shape of the absence is its own kind of information. Taemin set down the document. He knew Min-suk was right. He had known it for days, in the same peripheral way he'd known the lab envelope was on his desk, aware of it, not ready to address it, which was itself a deviation from character significant enough to concern him. He did not defer things. He did not table problems. He resolved them. He had been spending his mornings in a hospital room watching a boy eat tangerines. What are they saying? He said. Nothing specific. They see a pattern. You arrive late, you leave early, you are elsewhere, even when you're present. Dong-hyun thinks it's a woman. Dong-hyun has the analytical capacity of a parking cone. Yes. But parking cones repeat what they hear. And what he hears, he repeats in rooms I can't always monitor. Min-suk paused. There are other rooms, boss. Rooms I can't account for. Taemin understood what he wasn't saying. Their world was not a world of clean hierarchies and loyal silence. It was a world of competing interests dressed as allegiance, of men who smiled across tables and sold information before the meal was over. He had built his organization on the understanding that everyone was potentially compromised and structured his operations accordingly. He had never, before now, given anyone anything worth selling. It will be managed, Taemin said. Min-suk nodded. He picked up the folder. He was almost at the door when he stopped, the deliberate stop of a man who had been deciding all morning whether to say the next thing. The boy's name, he said, not turning around. It's becoming known. Not widely. But known. The air in the room changed. Explain. Someone at the hospital talked. A staff member, we think, not maliciously, most likely. A conversation overheard. Your visits were noted. He turned now. His expression was careful and serious. The name Park was connected to the pediatric ward. Someone in Kwan's circle made a query. Low-level, informal, the kind of question that sounds like gossip but isn't. Taemin said nothing. He was already calculating the sequence of exposures, the chain of information, the speed at which a low-level informal query became a tactical asset in the wrong hands. He ran it the way he ran everything, systematically, without panic, but something underneath the calculation was moving that wasn't calculation at all. Cairo's name. In a room he couldn't account for. Who made the query, he said. A man called Shin. He runs intelligence for the Kwan family. He's careful, he's patient, and he is very good at finding the precise thing a man values most. Min-suk let that sit. He found it. Taemin stood. He moved to the window. Seoul below, the city's million ordinary lives running their ordinary courses, indifferent to the architecture of danger being quietly assembled above them. He thought about room 412. The morning light. The pigeon on the ledge. A boy watching the world with his grandmother's eyes. He had brought this here. He had walked into that hospital room and he had kept walking back, and every visit had been a thread, and someone had followed the threads, and now Cairo, who had survived a surgery, who had eaten tangerines, who had almost smiled, was a variable in someone else's calculation. The thing in his chest that wasn't calculation tightened into something cold and absolute. He turned from the window. Find Shin, he said. His voice was even. Quiet. The specific quiet that his men had learned, over years, to be more afraid of than shouting. Find out exactly what he knows, who he's told, and how far it's traveled. Min-suk nodded. And Min-suk. He waited until the man met his eyes. Nobody touches that floor. Nobody goes near that hospital. Anyone who does answers to me personally. The sentence didn't need elaboration. In 14 years it never had. Min-suk left. The door closed. Taemin looked at his phone. At the last message he'd sent, a confirmation to the hospital that the next round of post-surgical care was fully funded, sent from a number that wasn't supposed to exist. He had made Cairo visible. He had done it slowly, repeatedly, with the carelessness of a man who had forgotten, for the first time in 2 decades, that the world he lived in did not allow for softness without consequences. He remembered now. He picked up his phone and made a call. He got the call at 11:47 p.m. It was Min-suk, which meant it was already past the point of being managed quietly. Min-suk did not call at 11:47 p.m. with good news. He called at 11:47 p.m. when the thing they had been watching had started moving faster than anticipated and the window for clean resolution was closing. Shin didn't stop at a query, Min-suk said. No preamble. He sent 2 men. They're in the area of the hospital now. Ground floor, we think. Possibly already inside. Taemin was already out of his chair. Sienna, he said. Night shift. She's there. Cairo. Room 412. He was in the elevator before Min-suk finished the sentence, jacket on, phone to his ear, the calculation running clean and cold and faster than it had ever run because the variable at the center of it was not money, was not territory, was not any of the things he had previously allowed himself to care about losing. How many of ours are close, he said. 3. I've already moved them. 2 on the ward entrance, 1 on the stairwell to the 4th floor. But boss, we have to be careful. Uniformed security is on site. If this becomes visible, it won't become visible. He stepped out of the elevator into the underground car park. The driver had the car running. Nobody draws anything inside that building. Nobody does anything that puts a nurse or a patient in the middle of this. Are we clear? Clear. And Min-suk. Sienna does not find out what this is. A pause. She's going to ask questions. Then we give her answers that aren't the answer. He got in the car. Find me Shin's men before I get there. The hospital at midnight was a different building than the hospital at noon. The lights were lower, the corridors longer, the sounds reduced to the essential, the soft percussion of equipment, the occasional murmur of a nurse's station, the particular silence of a building full of people whose bodies were doing the difficult work of staying alive. Taemin moved through it the way he moved through every room, without urgency in his pace, without anything in his expression that would draw a second look. A man in a good suit visiting someone late. It happened. People had reasons. The night staff glanced and returned to their work. He found the first one on the 2nd floor. Not Shin's man, his own. Youngwoo, 26, former military, the kind of quiet that was actually coiled. He was standing near a vending machine with a paper cup, not drinking from it. Stairwell, Youngwoo said, barely moving his mouth. One of Shin's on the 3rd floor landing. Waiting. For what? Instructions, we think. He's been on his phone. The other one. Ground floor. Near the main elevators. He came in as a visitor, signed in, got a badge. He knows the system. Taemin processed this. 2 men. Patient, professional, not rushing. Which meant they were waiting for a window, a shift change, a moment when the 4th floor corridor would be briefly unmonitored. They weren't here to cause chaos. They were here to cause a very specific, very quiet problem and leave before anyone understood what had happened. He knew the methodology because he had written it. Take the one in the stairwell off the board, he said. Quietly. Find him a reason to leave the building that he chooses himself. Youngwoo nodded once. He understood the grammar of that instruction. The one downstairs I'll handle, Taemin said. He found him near the elevator bank, mid-30s, unremarkable coat, visitor's badge clipped correctly, eyes doing the thing that trained eyes do when they're tracking exits and coverage without appearing to track anything at all. He was good. He would have fooled most people. He did not fool Taemin, who had hired and trained men exactly like him for 20 years. Taemin approached from the left, unhurried, and stopped beside him as if waiting for the elevator. He did not look at him directly. Tell Shin, he said quietly, at a volume that traveled no further than the 2 feet between them, that whatever he was paid to find out tonight, it isn't worth what comes after. He knows my name. He knows what my name means. This is the only conversation that happens before the other kind. The man's jaw tightened slightly. A micro-expression. Gone in under a second. You have about 4 minutes before my man comes back from the stairwell, Tae-min continued. I'd use them. The elevator arrived. Tae-min stepped inside. He did not look back. On the 4th floor the corridor was quiet. He walked to room 412 and stopped outside the door. Through the small window he could see the room, the monitors, the low light, the shape of Cairo sleeping, finally, in the way children sleep when their bodies are healing, deeply and without reservation. Sienna was in the chair beside the bed. She had fallen asleep with her head tilted to one side, one hand resting near Cairo's on the blanket. Her visitor's badge was still crooked. She looked, in sleep, like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had only just, in this unguarded moment, set it down. Tae-min stood at the window for a long moment. She would ask tomorrow why the second-floor vending machine was broken, why 2 visitors had signed out after midnight without going up. She would notice the things that didn't quite line up, because Sienna had always noticed. She was not a woman you could keep entirely in the dark. But tonight she was asleep. Tonight Cairo was safe. Tonight the threat had walked out through the main entrance and the corridor was quiet and the monitors beeped their soft, indifferent rhythm. He stayed at the window until he was certain. Then he took the elevator back down, walked out into the cold night air, and called Min-suk. It's done, he said. Shin's man talked before Youngwoo convinced him to leave. Shin knows you were there personally. Good. Tae-min stood on the pavement outside the hospital entrance, the city running its quiet midnight version of itself around him. I want him to know. That changes things. Yes, Tae-min said. It does. He looked up at the 4th floor. Room 412 was dark from the outside, just a window like every other window, giving nothing away. It was always going to come to this, he said, more to himself than to Min-suk. I just chose when. He got in the car. The hospital disappeared behind him in the dark. He spent 3 days planning it. Not because it was complicated, the mechanics of it were straightforward enough, for a man who had spent 2 decades constructing systems designed to be dismantled without leaving evidence. He knew exactly which threads to pull and in which order. He knew which accounts to surface and which to bury. He knew the precise sequence of events that would make Park Tae-min's exit from the organization look not like a choice but like an inevitability, a man undone by his own exposure, his leverage spent, his empire made suddenly and permanently ungovernable. He had, in fact, designed the escape route years ago. Not for himself. As a contingency. A professional habit, the way a surgeon knows where the exits are in every building he enters, not because he plans to run, but because the knowledge of it is its own form of control. He spent 3 days not because it was complicated. He spent 3 days because once he pulled the first thread, there was no version of this where he came back. He sat with that. He sat with it at his desk, at his window, in the car between meetings he attended with half his attention while the other half ran the calculus of everything he was about to lose. The organization. The accounts. The properties. The infrastructure of 20 years assembled deal by deal, decision by decision, with a ruthlessness he had never apologized for because it had never, until now, cost him anything he hadn't chosen to spend. He thought about his father. A man who had also built something from nothing, through methods that didn't survive scrutiny, who had died at his desk with everything he'd made and no one to leave it to who hadn't been damaged by the making of it. Tae-min had told himself he would be different. He had meant something else by different. He had meant more successful, more controlled, more precise in his application of the necessary darkness. He had not meant this. On the 3rd day he called Min-suk. He told him everything. Not the operational details, those he delivered in the clean, sequenced way he delivered all instructions, with clarity and without sentiment. But before that, the rest. Cairo. The lab report. The 8 years. The night at the hospital. He told it plainly, the way you tell a man who has stood beside you for 14 years something you owe him the truth of before it becomes the truth of everyone. Min-suk listened without interrupting. When Tae-min finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You've already decided, Min-suk said. Yes. Then why are you telling me? Because you deserve to know before the structure shifts. You'll need time to reposition. I've arranged something, there's an account, separate from everything, that won't be touched in what comes next. Enough for you to build something clean if you choose to. Min-suk looked at him across the desk. 14 years in his face. The specific worn quality of a man who had given a significant portion of his life to something and was being handed the bill. And if I don't want something clean, he said. Then that's your choice. Tae-min held his gaze. It was always your choice. I just made it easier to make the other one. The silence between them was the kind that closes something. They both felt it close. The Kwon family will move on the organization within a week of you stepping back, Min-suk said finally. Practical now. The way loyalty expresses itself in men like them, not in sentiment but in the continued application of competence. I know. Shin will claim credit. He'll say he's the one who found your weakness. Let him say it. It'll make you look finished. Tae-min said the word cleanly. That's the point. A finished man is not a man anyone wastes resources hunting. A finished man's family is not a leverage point anymore. There's nothing to leverage. Min-suk absorbed this. The architecture of it. The deliberate self-destruction as its own form of protection, not running, not hiding, but removing the very thing that made them a target. Making Park Tae-min small enough that no one needed to reach through him to get to Cairo. It's the right move, Min-suk said quietly. Not a compliment. Just an honest assessment from a man who had spent 14 years assessing moves. I know, Tae-min said. He pulled the first thread that evening. By morning 2 offshore accounts had surfaced in channels that would reach the relevant authorities within 72 hours. By afternoon 3 of his properties had transferred to names that led nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, a maze designed to consume the attention of anyone trying to follow the money for the next several years. By the following evening the organization's operational hierarchy had received, through separate and untraceable means, information that would keep them occupied fighting each other long after they'd stopped looking for him. He did not watch it happen. He had designed it not to require watching. What he did instead was drive to the hospital. It was early evening. Cairo's discharge had been confirmed for the following morning, the surgical team satisfied, the heart doing what repaired hearts do when they are given the chance, which is the stubborn and remarkable work of continuing. He found Sienna in the room packing the small collection of things that had accumulated over weeks, books, a spare hoodie, the drawings Cairo had made on printer paper cadged from the nurse's station. She looked up when he came in. Cairo was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed in his own clothes for the first time since Tae-min had known him. Small dark jeans. A sweater slightly too large for him, the sleeves past his wrists. He looked both entirely like himself and somehow new, the way people look when you see them outside the context where you first understood them. He looked at Tae-min. You came, Cairo said. I said I would. Sienna had gone still over the bag she was packing. She wasn't looking at him but she was listening. He knew her quality of listening, the way her whole body oriented towards sound when something mattered. I need to tell you something, Tae-min said. He was looking at Sienna now. She turned. She read his face the way she had always read his face, with the accuracy of someone who had spent a long time learning its grammar. Something she found there made her expression shift. Not fear. Something more complex than fear. What did you do? She said quietly. What needed doing, he said. It's handled. Both of you are, it's handled. No one is coming. He paused. Not now. Not later. I made sure of it. She stared at him. Processing. Following the implications of those words to the place they led, which was a place that required something significant to have been sacrificed. Taemin. Don't. He said it gently. Don't ask me to explain it tonight. I'll explain everything. But not tonight. A long silence. Cairo was watching them both with those steady, ancient eyes. Taking his quiet inventory of the room. He slid off the edge of the bed and crossed to Taemin and stood in front of him and looked up. Are you okay? Cairo asked. The question arrived like something thrown from a great height. Taemin looked down at his son. At the boy who had waited in hospital beds and eaten tangerines and asked questions without fear and watched the world with a patience that shouldn't have been possible at 7 years old. At the person he had almost never known existed. At the thing he had spent 20 years building an empire to avoid feeling, which was this, specific, unbearable, necessary. He crouched down to Cairo's level. I will be, he said. Cairo considered this with his usual seriousness. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, the way he'd been satisfied the first morning with the answer not yet, always more comfortable with honesty than with reassurance. Taemin stood. Outside the window Seoul was doing what it always did, indifferent and luminous, the city continuing its vast and complicated life without reference to the small room where a man had just finished dismantling everything he'd built and found, unexpectedly, that his hands felt lighter for it. He looked at Sienna. She was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face in 8 years, the one that meant she was deciding whether to trust something. Whether the thing in front of her was real. He waited. He had learned, lately, how to wait. Discharge was at 10 in the morning. There was paperwork, as there always is, forms that reduced the last several weeks to checkboxes and signatures, to dates and dosages and follow-up appointments printed in a font too small for the significance of what they represented. Sienna handled it at the nurse's station with the focused efficiency of a woman who had spent years navigating systems that required you to prove, repeatedly and in triplicate, that your crisis was real. She signed where they told her to sign. She collected what they told her to collect. She thanked the nurses by name, each of them, because she had learned their names in the first week and had not forgotten a single one. Taemin stood to the side and did not offer to help with the paperwork. He understood, without being told, where the boundaries were. He was learning them the way you learn the geography of a new country, not from a map but from moving through it, from the small corrections that come when you step somewhere you weren't supposed to and someone's expression tells you before the words do. Sienna had not asked him to be here this morning. He had come anyway. But he had come quietly, without assumption, without the full weight of his presence deployed in the way he usually deployed it. He was practicing, for the first time in his adult life, the discipline of restraint that wasn't strategic. It was harder than he'd expected. Cairo was dressed and ready long before the paperwork was finished. He sat in the chair beside the bed, not on it, beside it, because he was leaving and had already made that distinction, with a small backpack in his lap that one of the nurses had brought him, filled with the drawings he'd made and 2 books and a tangerine Taemin had left that morning, which he had placed carefully on top of everything else. He watched the door. He was ready to go. When the final form was signed and the last nurse had wished them well and the room had been reduced to nothing that belonged to them, Sienna lifted the larger bag onto her shoulder and reached for Cairo's hand and they walked out into the corridor. Taemin carried the bag she'd left behind. She didn't tell him to. She didn't tell him not to. She looked at it in his hands for one brief moment and then looked away, which was its own kind of answer. The elevator down was quiet. Cairo stood between them, not deliberately, it was simply where the space was, and watched the numbers descend with the focused attention he brought to things that were about to change. He had been on this elevator many times in the past weeks. This was the last time. He seemed to understand this without anyone explaining it. In the lobby, the morning light came through the glass frontage in long pale slants. After weeks of fluorescent corridors and the blue-white light of medical equipment, it looked almost excessive. Rich. The ordinary world, doing its ordinary thing, entirely indifferent to the fact that something significant was walking out into it. Sienna's car was in the short-stay bay. A practical car. Several years old, maintained carefully, one small dent on the rear passenger door that had never been repaired. He noted it the way he noted everything and felt something move through him that wasn't judgment, something closer to tenderness, looking at the small evidence of a life managed alone, of things that had to wait because other things were more urgent. He loaded the bags into the boot. She had a system, specific things in specific places, and he watched once and followed it without comment. Cairo stood on the pavement beside the car and looked at the street. At the people moving past. At a bus, at a dog being walked by an old man, at a food cart on the corner releasing steam into the cold morning air. He looked at all of it with the expression of someone returning to a world they had wondered, quietly, whether they would see again. Then he turned and looked at Taemin. "Are you coming with us?" he asked. The directness of it did what Cairo's directness always did, arrived without warning, found the exact place that was undefended. Taemin looked at Sienna over the roof of the car. She was looking back at him. Not telling him the answer. Not making it easy. But not making it impossible either, and he had learned, in 8 years of her absence and 3 weeks of her proximity, the precise difference between those two things. "Not today," he said to Cairo. He kept his voice even. "But I'll see you soon." Cairo absorbed this. Checked it against whatever internal instrument he used for measuring the truth of things people told him. Apparently it passed. He nodded. Then he got in the car, settled his backpack on his lap, and looked out the window at the street, already watching the world go by. Sienna opened the driver's door. She paused with her hand on the roof. She didn't look at him, but she wasn't not looking at him. She was somewhere in between, in the complicated territory she had been navigating since the morning he'd walked into room 412. "You said you'd explain everything," she said quietly. "I will. Soon." "Yes." A pause. The city moved around them. A bus passed. The steam from the food cart drifted sideways in the cold. "There's a coffee place," she said. Still not quite looking at him. 2 blocks from where we're staying. It's nothing special. Opens at 8. He understood what she was offering. Not forgiveness, that was a longer road, and they both knew the distance of it. Not trust, that had to be rebuilt from the ground up, carefully, with no shortcuts, and he was prepared to do it however long it took. She was offering something smaller and more significant than either. A coordinate. A place and a time. A door left open by a woman who had every reason to close it. "I'll be there," he said. She got in the car. The engine turned over. He stepped back onto the pavement and watched her pull out of the bay and into the slow morning traffic. In the back window, Cairo turned and looked at him. He raised one hand. Small. Just a wave. Taemin raised his. He stood on the pavement until the car was gone. Until it had merged with the ordinary flow of the ordinary city and become indistinguishable from everything else moving through the morning, just a car among cars, a life among lives. Then he stood there a little longer. He had nothing to go back to. No office, no empire, no floor-to-ceiling glass with soul spread out below it like proof of something. He had a phone, a coat, and an appointment at a coffee place 2 blocks from somewhere he didn't know yet, at 8 in the morning, for as many mornings as it took. He had, for the first time in 20 years, nothing to manage except himself. He put his hands in his pockets. He turned. He began to walk, not to a car, not to a meeting, not toward any of the destinations that had structured every movement of his life for 2 decades. Just walking. Into the morning. Into the cold and ordinary and legitimate air of a city that didn't know his name anymore. It felt, unexpectedly, like breathing. Like the first real breath after a long time underwater, breaking the surface into something bright and cold and new, uncertain, yes, and irreversible, and nothing like control. But real. For the first time in a very long time. Real. 6 months later, Taemin learned how to make breakfast. Not well, at first. The first morning he attempted it, he burned the eggs and set off the smoke alarm in the small apartment Sienna was renting 3 floors above a dry cleaner on a street that smelled like sesame oil on weekday mornings. Cairo stood in the kitchen doorway in his pajamas, hair flattened on one side from sleep, and watched the smoke rise from the pan with the expression of a scientist observing a failed experiment, interested, not alarmed, cataloging data. The heat was too high, Cairo said. I know that now. You should know it before. Yes, Taemin agreed. That would have been better. He opened the window. Cairo climbed onto the counter stool and watched him try again with the focused attention he brought to everything, occasionally offering observations that were technically advice but delivered with the neutrality of a weather report. Too much oil. The wrong pan. You're moving it too much, you have to let it sit. The second attempt was edible. Cairo ate it without complaint, which was the highest available praise. The coffee place 2 blocks away had become a Thursday thing. Not exclusively, Taemin came other days too, for school drop-offs, for the occasional dinner, for the slow and non-linear work of being present in a way that couldn't be rushed or bought or resolved through the application of strategy. But Thursdays were theirs. Sienna with her hands around a cup, him across the small table, the morning moving around them while they talked about everything and nothing and the long middle distance of what came next. They were not what they had been. He understood that. He didn't try to retrieve something that no longer existed, which was one of the things she had needed from him before she could sit across the table from him without her jaw set. What they had been was a chapter that had closed badly. What they were becoming was something without a name yet, careful, provisional, built from honesty rather than from the version of himself he'd once presented to her like a finished thing. She had questions. She asked them on Thursdays, mostly. He answered them without editing, which was the only way she would accept answers. Some of them were hard to answer. He answered them anyway. He had decided that transparency, for him, was not a natural state but a practice, something you did repeatedly until the discomfort of it became familiar enough to sit with. Some Thursdays she laughed at something he said. He was working toward more of those. Min-suk had taken the clean account and done something unexpected with it. He had opened a restaurant. Korean, small, 12 tables, in a neighborhood that needed one. Taemin found out through a text message that said only the name, the address, and Thursday evenings are good, which was an invitation phrased as information, which was entirely characteristic. He went on a Thursday evening. Min-suk came out of the kitchen briefly, looked at Taemin sitting in the corner with Sienna and Cairo, and returned to the kitchen without a word. But he sent out an extra dish, something he hadn't ordered, something from a recipe Taemin recognized from a meal they'd eaten together years ago in a different city in a different life. He didn't say anything about it. Neither did Min-suk. Some things didn't require language. Cairo's follow-up appointments were every 8 weeks. Taemin drove them. Not always, some mornings Sienna had a shift and took him alone, and those mornings Taemin sat in his apartment, which was 20 minutes away and deliberately not too close, and did not check his phone too many times. He was learning the architecture of a life structured around someone else's schedule rather than his own, which required a different kind of patience than the patience he'd previously practiced. That kind had been strategic. This kind was simply love. He was learning the word. Not its definition, he'd always known the definition. Its weight. The specific daily gravity of it, the way it made you vulnerable not in a single dramatic moment but in 10,000 small ones. The smoke alarm. The Thursday coffee. The back seat of a practical car with one unrepaired dent, driving through morning traffic to a hospital that had once been a battlefield and was now just the place Cairo got his heart checked. The heart was doing well. Better than well, the cardiologist said at the last appointment, with the carefully modulated enthusiasm of a man trained not to use words like remarkable. He used the word remarkable anyway. Cairo nodded seriously and asked a precise question about recovery trajectories that made the cardiologist pause and then answer more thoroughly than he'd anticipated. In the corridor afterward, walking back to the car, Cairo reached up and put his hand in Taemin's. He did it the way he did most things, without announcement, without drama, as a simple statement of a fact he had apparently decided was settled. Taemin looked down at the small hand in his. The long fingers. His mother's hands. He closed his own around it and kept walking. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed to be said. That evening Taemin sat at Sienna's kitchen table while she cooked and Cairo did homework across from him, the apartment full of ordinary sounds, the scrape of a pencil, the hiss of something in a pan, music low from a phone on the counter. The dry cleaner 3 floors below had closed for the night. The street outside was settling into its evening version of itself. Cairo looked up from his homework. "You're not doing anything," he observed. "No." "Why?" Taemin looked at him. "At the kitchen." At Sienna's back, her shoulders relaxed, moving with the easy rhythm of someone comfortable in their own space. At the drawings on the refrigerator, Cairo's, accumulated over months, held up with mismatched magnets. At the homework spread across the table, at the pencil in Cairo's hand, at the ordinary and unremarkable and entirely extraordinary fact of this room and these people and this evening, which was Tuesday, which was nothing special, which was everything. "I'm just here," Taemin said. Cairo considered this. Then he nodded, apparently finding it sufficient, and looked back down at his homework. Outside, Seoul did what it always did. The city moved and hummed and continued its vast indifferent life, and somewhere in it, in a small apartment above a dry cleaner on a street that smelled like sesame oil, a man who had once built an empire sat at a kitchen table and did nothing at all. And found, in the nothing, everything he had been looking for.